So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the second Carla presentation on Zoom. We are really excited to have you here. My name is Kate Paisani and I'm the Carla director. We are so delighted today to have Darren LaScotte and Elaine Tarone presenting on their project called Channeling Voices to Improve Second Language Intelligibility. Darren is a teaching specialist in the Minnesota English Language Program here at the University of Minnesota, and we're really excited that he's going to be starting the PhD program in second language education here in the fall. Elaine is Professor Emerita from the University of Minnesota and the former director of Carla. So I'm going to pass the baton over to them so they can get started.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for tuning into our webinar today, and we hope that you're all well. Darren LaScotte and I are excited to tell you a little bit about our recent research project at the University of Minnesota on teaching second language pronunciation for intelligibility. I'm going to give background for the first 10 minutes or so, and then Darren will tell you about our study. And as we talk, again, just jot down questions or observations you have in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And when we finish, we're going to read your entries and respond to them. Okay, let's go. Next. So when you teach students to pronounce a second language, what's your goal? Do you want them to pronounce everything the way a native speaker of the language does? That might be impossible for some adult learners, and current research suggests that a native speaker accent is not as important anyway as intelligibility. Can people understand you easily when you speak? So what makes a second language speaker intelligible then? Research suggests it's not the accuracy of their pronunciation of phonemes or segments, such as R as in burro in Spanish, or the as in this in English. Research suggests that suprasegmentals like intonation, stress patterns, pausing, and rhythm are far more important for intelligibility, especially when these synchronize with gesture and other nonverbal expressions. Next. So there have been two overall approaches to teaching the pronunciation of a second language, bottom up and top down. In the early days of applied linguistics, bottom-up teaching prevailed. So based on contrastive linguistics, teachers focused on phonemes or segments that were different from those in the learner's native language. Learners were given linguistic descriptions of and were asked to produce and perceive phonemes, first alone, then in isolated words, then in sentences on the page. And it's interesting that this approach didn't work so well when teachers tried it to teach intonation or stress, possibly because those forms are often tied to the social situation and emotional factors. Top-down approaches to teaching, on the other hand, presented, I think, initially by Pennington and Richards in 1986, these exposed students to spoken second language in discourse. It asked them to notice intonation, stress, and rhythm as speakers communicated meaning, stance, emotion, identity. Next. So second language acquisition research on phonology of interlanguage or pronunciation patterns in learner language established from the very beginning that social factors in the situation were very influential. So second language learners' pronunciation clearly changed depending on who they were talking to, how formal the situation was, and how emotionally involved they were. One study, an early study, for example, interesting, I think, because of its theory, is Giora et al., 1972. So Alexander Giora was a psychiatrist who promoted his theory that it was empathy with other speakers that really shaped a second language learner's pronunciation. And he set about asking how could he prove the importance of empathy by experimentally changing how much learners empathized with models. And his solution was alcohol. Perhaps interesting in days of COVID also, I don't know. But anyway, he designed an experiment in which two groups of second language learners were asked to imitate the pronunciation of second language words. While they were doing this, the experimental group got alcohol in cocktails in the amounts of half an ounce, ounce and a half, 2. The control group got pretend cocktails, no alcohol. So the experimental group's ability to imitate models got progressively and significantly closer to the model, but only up to 1.5 ounces. After that point, their pronunciation deteriorated for reasons other than empathy. The control group pronunciation did not change at all. Now, as I said earlier, after that, there was lots of subsequent research that really showed that second language learners were sensitive in their pronunciation to social factors. More recently, SLA theory has returned to the study of the impact of social context, interlocutor, empathy, and nonverbals on acquisition of second languages at all levels, not just pronunciation. For example, the Douglas Fir Group in 2016 is a group of second language researchers who all agreed that social contextual factors must be included in any theory of SLA, and particularly factors like community norms, learner's identity, and agency. Second language acquisition happens in social context. Next. So Darren's and my research takes place within that theoretical framework I just described. We focus particularly on Bakhtin's sociocultural theory and Bakhtin's construct of voice. Bakhtin took the position that as we interact with others, we internalize the voices of significant others, perhaps those we empathize with. A voice is a combination of linguistic features of speech with the other person's overall stance being communicated, their values, their identity, their emotion, their entire way of interacting. The best example of voice I can think of is of a mother who speaks to a misbehaving child who suddenly realizes that she is saying words and expressing values her mother said to her in the same way her mother said it. They might say, I hear my mother's voice coming out of my mouth. Darren and I suggest that second language learners can internalize second language voices in the same way. Also of interest to Darren and myself is Bakhtin's construct of double voicing. This occurs in sarcasm and mockery, where a speaker's utterance simultaneously conveys two stances, one their own and one somebody else's. This can occur a lot in constructed dialogue, where you're telling a story, and in the middle of the story, you start to speak with the voice of somebody else. You enact their voice. Supporting research to this approach is that of Moreno, 2016. She showed that Heriberto, whenever he told a story, he would lose his normal Hispanic pronunciation when he was speaking with his American friend's voice. Next. Darren's and my research tests the use of a top-down approach to teaching pronunciation for intelligibility. It's called the Mirroring Project. Developed and used with international teaching assistants, or ITAs, up until now, it has been used in longer courses, sometimes 15 weeks, after the ITAs have studied English as a second language in a bottom-up way. In a final top-down units, the ITAs select a speaker they like, perhaps empathize with, from, for example, a TED Talk, and then they video record themselves trying to reproduce the model's exact words in the way that they say it. After feedback and practice, the ITAs are asked to channel their model's voice by re-recording a presentation they made at the beginning of the course. But this time, they want to produce it the way they think their model speaker would have given that talk. Praat acoustic analysis and qualitative analysis shows dramatic shifts toward more intelligibility in presenting their own ideas and words. Wider pitch and intensity range, better stress placement, more pausing to highlight intended meaning. Next. So our study was intended to see whether this mirroring approach, which works well in a small 15-week class to improve ITA's intelligibility in teaching, whether that approach can also be effective in improving the pronunciation and the intelligibility of second language students in shorter intensive English programs. Here's the research question. I'll pause to let you read it, and then Darren will tell you about our study.
Okay, so thank you. So to answer our study's research question, we analyzed the video recordings of 7 adult English learners' verbal and nonverbal linguistic patterns when they were mirrored and then subsequently channeled the speech of others in rehearsed presentations. This was done over the course of 7 weeks, and 7 weeks is what we are calling a short-term pedagogical treatment, as opposed to a longer 15-week period of time. This was classroom-based research, meaning that the participants of this study are limited to the participants that were actually students in the course of the time of data collection. So we did not try to diversify the participant base in any way or further enlarge in it. It was just the students who were taking the elective course on pronunciation improvement in the IEP. Nevertheless, as we're going to see in this next slide, participant demographic information did vary somewhat. So here we have pseudonyms for everyone on the very left-hand side. 6 of our 7 participants are female and represent languages such as Thai, Malay, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Spanish. Proficiency level 2 varied in the IEP. These were determined by placement tests and exit scores in the program. Some participants had already scored high enough on another proficiency exam, such as the TOEFL, that they were admitted to degree programs and they were exempt from other ESL coursework. So in terms of their proficiency, they can be seen as high advanced or perhaps superior in that range. The data analyzed in the study is comprised of 4 video recordings. So in week 1, recording 1, this was a diagnostic for the class in which students were asked, introduce yourself to the class and tell us about your major. And this is a diagnostic because they got feedback about their particular English pronunciation patterns, what they should focus on throughout the curriculum as we progressed through the course. It also serves as a reference point for the beginning of our pedagogical treatment. Following this feedback from the diagnostic and based on participants' own interest, they chose for themselves a model speaker, someone they wanted to emulate. Could be that the speaker had pronunciation patterns they were told that they should be working on themselves. It could be someone they admired, right? Like a role model. So in week 4, we did recording number 2, which was the first version or the cold trial version of the mirroring project. So here participants are practicing internalizing speech, nonverbal, verbal communication as they try to mirror word for word and gesture for gesture their model speaker. Following recording 2, they got some feedback and also did a self-critique. They looked at their video and the model speaker's video and noticed areas of improvement. Where is this speaker going up when I'm not going up? Where are they pausing where I'm just rushing through, right? What are they doing with their hands? What is their facial expression like? So there were a few additional weeks of rehearsal, and then in week 6, they recorded a final version of the mirroring project. Following the mirroring project, and this is an extension originally from Meyers, is channeling. So here they were tasked with returning to recording number 1. So week 7, recording number 4, they're again introducing themselves, telling us about themselves, about their major, but instead they're doing it with the voice, the linguistic and discursive features from their model speaker's speech segment that they were mirroring. All right, so tell me about your major, but do it as Barack Obama or whoever they had chosen. So these 4 video recordings were all analyzed with speech analysis software, Praat, and we were looking at 2 known correlates of intelligibility. So we did quantitative analysis for both pitch range and mean intensity. So pitch range is important because all native speakers of a language share an understanding and an agreement about how pitch range and changes in pitch can communicate meaning. And one way that we do this in English is through high pitch to communicate important information, right? And also mark our speech paragraphs. So a greater range of pitch demonstrates a greater ability to mark highs and lows of our speech to convey focus and prominence, which leads to intelligibility. For mean intensity, so intensity is here is measured in decibels, it's perceived as loudness. And so a greater average loudness for these presentations indicates that it's easier to hear the stress placement, that we're not having participants trail off as much, muttering, things like that. So a greater mean intensity just means it's easier for the listener to hear and understand, therefore making their speech more intelligible as we hear markings of stress, focus, and prominence. Following Tarone and Meyers, we looked specifically at the first speech paragraph of each of their talks. So a speech paragraph can be objectively identified. It's by phonological criteria. So we're looking at, through Praat, we're looking at a high pitch onset and then a gradual descent in pitch to a low pitch close, which was often accompanied by drop in volume or pausing. And we're looking specifically at not at their later speech paragraphs, but the first one for each talk. Because as Lucy Pickering maintains, key choice or beginning pitch level for a talk is set with the first speech paragraph. So all other changes in pitch, variation, all of that is in relation to the key choice. So by comparing the first speech paragraph of each of our 4 videos, we're able to ensure some kind of consistency as we are tracking these modifications to their speech. In addition to these quantitative analyses for pitch range and mean intensity, we also explored the underlying dynamics of the mirroring project. So what about this mirroring led our participants to modify their pitch, their amplitude, their pausing, right? And so as part of this presentation, we're going to show one of our participant learners through analysis of how the suprasegmentals in her speech paragraphs became more and more like the speech paragraphs of her model speaker over time. So just jumping into the results, we're going to start with the big picture, overall pitch range and mean intensity through Praat. So our first graph here, this shows shifts in pitch range. So this is in hertz, and it's with all 7 participants and all 4 recordings. So you can see on the graph, starting with Fong Fan and going to Eduardo, our 7 participants. And then for each of those, the very left bar represents recording number 1. Tell me about yourself, tell me about your major. The orange one on the right is channeling. So it's the same verbatim speech paragraph, but with the linguistic and discursive features mapped onto that from their model speaker as they're channeling. And so what you may notice looking at across these 4 video recordings is we're seeing an upward trend. We're seeing an increase in terms of pitch range from recording 1 to recording 4. There is some variation as from getting from recording 1 to recording 4, and that's likely due to the tone of the mirroring, the segment that they were mirroring for their project, which we could talk about later, I suppose, for the Q&A. But overall, we're seeing an increase. And just to make that clear and give a better picture, here we isolate just those 2 recordings, the beginning reference point of the study and the end reference point. So some a greater increase than others, but an increase for all 7 participants, and the same verbatim transcript for both of these presentations. In addition to the quantitative analysis for pitch range, we also looked at mean intensity, so loudness. So this next graph here shows again all 4 video recordings, all 7 participants, and we're seeing an upward trend or an increase in intensity mean across all 7. Okay, so again, contributing to their intelligibility as it's making their stress placement, focus, and prominence easier to hear. What's important to note as we're looking at these, and I'll likely bring it up again later, is that these changes to the correlates of intelligibility are not from a bottom-up linguistic analysis where they're sitting and thinking about widening pitch range or increasing loudness. Instead, they're just trying to mirror exactly. They're trying to act like actors, right? Just mirror the model speakers they had chosen. So it's really a contextualized, a top-down approach that they're calling the mirroring project. And so to explore the underlying dynamics of this top-down approach, we're going to look at one of these participants, Song, here in the middle, and see how her speech changes over time. Okay, so this is recording 1. So again, this is our diagnostic from week 1. And here on the screen, you'll see a Praat readout, a visual from Praat, which if you haven't seen this before, the top 2 channels, that is amplitude over time. The time is given in seconds at the very bottom of the readout, which is 29.9 seconds, so 30 seconds. But what you're seeing at the top for amplitude can be remarked as loudness. So the greater the width, I suppose, of that bar, the louder it was. And also when you see very close to nothing, the quieter. So it also shows instances of pausing at the top. At the bottom row, we see pitch contours. Okay, and at the, so related to the intonation. And then at the right, we have the readouts with the numbers. And the numbers that are highlighted here are those same numbers that we were looking at with the earlier graphs. So intensity mean, specifically, we're looking at that number over time going up, and pitch range at the bottom. So as I'm going to play a video clip, and some of these video clips are just louder than others. And so for some of them, I've marked loud, in which case you might need to have your finger on the dial to change your volume on your computer, because it's just sharing my computer sound. So it might be louder or quieter than the speech you're hearing from my microphone. But as we listen, I'd like you to see what you notice about her first recording, and maybe what feedback you would give her as an instructor if you were her pronunciation instructor. Okay, so I'm going to click play.
And actually, many people just have a big misunderstanding about my major. They just thought people who major in economics should know how to get money, should know how to be rich, should have many knowledge about finance, about stock market. Actually, it's totally wrong. So I still remember on my major course, my professor told me, sorry, you cannot be rich by studying economics. Yeah, it's so sad.
So maybe what you noticed when you were looking at the Praat readout and listening is that there are a few instances of pausing that you can see at the top 2 channels. And her speech also does not vary much in terms of loudness, right? So instead it remains monotonous. And this interpretation that her speech is monotonous is further supported if you're looking at her pitch contours at the bottom. So those appear so consistent across, it's perhaps easy to imagine a straight line going across them. And this is very typical of a syllable timed language, right? So very characteristic of a syllable timed language. And this is the feedback that Song got from her first recording from the diagnostic, things that she should be working on. So pitch, amplitude, and pausing in her speech for the remainder of the course. So after getting this feedback and based on her own interests, Song, for the mirroring project, she selected for herself a model speaker. And this next segment I'm going to show is her model speaker, Can Wen-ju, and her TEDx Boise talk, I Am Not Your Asian Stereotype. So already looking at the Praat readout, you might remark differences from what you saw with pitch, amplitude, and pausing from Song. And as we listen to this, I'd like you just to also see what differences you can perceive as you're listening. Okay.
My name is Canwin, and I play both the piano and the violin. I aspire to someday be a doctor, and my favorite subject is calculus. My mom and dad are tiger parents who won't let me go to sleepovers, but they make up for it by serving my favorite meal every single day, rice. And I'm a really bad driver. So my question for you now is, how long did it take you to figure out I was joking?
Okay, so characteristic of highly intelligible speech in English, we're seeing observable stress and pausing and the rising and falling of intonation for Kenwood speech. So, and that also clearly marks for thought groups, right? Or pausing for dramatic effect. And this is very characteristic of English. So a stress-timed language that we're seeing, which makes this particular model for Song, she might empathize with her and for other reasons as well, but for her pronunciation, this makes her a great model for her and the mirroring project. Okay, you can also see on the right-hand side how the speaker has a much wider range than Song had, right? And higher intensity mean too. So Song's second recording, which took place in week 4, is her first attempt to mirror Canwin. And already you might notice how features of her speech on the Praat readout are markedly different from those of her first recording, as she's trying to enact word for word and gesture for gesture the TEDx Boise talk segment. As we listen, what you'll hear, she actually replaced my name is Canwind and with her own name, her real name. So I've distorted that in the speech segment that we're going to listen to protect her privacy. So you'll hear that strange sound at the beginning. But besides that, listen and see what you notice in terms of her pausing, her amplitude, and pitch. You can also see how the pitch range and intensity are also quite different already in terms of, in comparison to her first recording. So here, as we listen.
My name is Young and I play both the piano and the violin. I aspire to someday be a doctor, and my favorite subject is calculus. My mom and dad are tiger parents who won't let me go to sleepover, but they will make up by serving my favorite meal every day, rice. And I'm a bad driver. So my question for you now is, how long did it take you to figure out I was joking?
Okay, so already there are clear instances of pausing and a wider range in volume. There's also a much wider range in terms of her pitch to mark prominence and focus. So after completing a self-critique, looking at her video and seeing where the areas are for improvement in comparison to the model speaker's original TEDx talk, she recorded a final version of the mirroring project 2 weeks later in week 6. So this speech segment, recording 3, mirroring final, Song says the model speaker's name instead of her own as she attempts to mirror the speech exactly, word for word and gesture for gesture. So we are going to listen to the final version here now and see what you notice.
And I play both the piano and the violin. I aspire someday to be a doctor, and my favorite subject is calculus. My parents are tiger parents who won't let me to go to sleepovers, but they will make up it by serving my favorite meal every single day, rice. And I'm a really bad driver. So my question for you now is, how long did it take you to figure out I was joking?
Okay, so in this third video recording, the final mirroring project, Song is delivering a performance that even more closely approximates that of her model speaker, Canwin. We're seeing this in terms of her patterns for stress, her patterns for pausing, and intonation patterns as well. And these are the very aspects that Song was working on following the evaluation of her diagnostic recording to make her speech more intelligible. And importantly, again, this is coming from a top-down contextualized approach, where it's the whole package, right? Where she's trying to mirror the segment exactly by becoming can win during her TEDx Boise talk, which is what we're calling the top-down process and advocating for pronunciation instruction. So 1 week later, in week 7, Song was tasked with returning to recording 1. So tell me about yourself, tell me about your major. Only this time, she was to channel her model speaker's linguistic and discursive features, so her speech, and how Canwin might deliver this if she were in the room. So looking at this Praat readout of her final recording, see already as I transition to recording 4, how aspects of that might look somewhat similar. As we listen, notice the difference in monotony that we saw with that first recording with the flat pitch contours, the few instances of pausing, not a lot of loudness, change in volume, to what we're going to hear for recording 4 as I play it.
Many people have big misunderstanding of my major. They thought people who major in economics should know how to get money. For example, know how to get money from stock market. Actually, it's totally wrong. I still remember in one of my major courses, my professor told us, sorry guys, you cannot be rich by studying economics. So sad, isn't it?
So in comparison to her first recording, Song has greatly improved her stress and her pitch to signal prominence and focus in delivering her own original message, right, about herself and about why this common misconception about her major in economics. In the top 2 rows, we can see several instances of pausing, which coincide with her thought groups. The pauses also appear to be more frequent and longer than in her first recording. On the bottom row, the pitch contours also show a much wider range than they did in recording number 1, again approximating the contours used by her model speaker. So here, Song is much more intelligible, and her speech much more closely resembles typical patterns in English, a stress-timed language. So to demonstrate in greater detail these shifts, we pulled a few select segments from recording 1, 4, and from the mirroring project, lines from the speech paragraph instead of the whole 30-second speech paragraph to show how some of these aspects of suprasegmental pronunciation are being channeled. So for this first speech segment here, this is from recording 1. We're calling it Big Misunderstanding. And we've included the transcript here at the bottom, just above where the pitch contours are. So you can see by looking at the flat pitch contours, you can hypothesize what you might be hearing soon, or recall from what we've heard earlier. As she says, many people just have big misunderstanding about my major. So here as we listen.
Many people just have a big misunderstanding about my major.
Okay, and it's short, so I'm gonna play it one more time.
Many people just have a big misunderstanding about my major.
Okay, now compare this to recording 4. Okay, well, it's the same verbatim transcript, almost identical line, right? But channeling segments from Canwin's talk. Okay, as we listen.
Many people have big misunderstanding of my major.
Okay, one more time.
Many people have big misunderstanding of my major.
Okay, so very different. And we need only look at a few samples from the mirroring project, the TED Talk, to see where Song might be getting some of these features of suprasegmentals from Canwin. So this next clip I'm going to show is from the mirroring project. It's from the final version of the mirroring project. So here we call it Tiger Parents. So in this short clip, Song introduces, as Canwin, as she's mirroring, she introduces her parents as tiger parents, and she emphasizes tiger as new, important information for us to hear. She also puts emphasis on the negative particle won't. Okay, So here as we listen.
My parents are tiger parents who won't let me to go to sleepovers.
Okay, we're gonna listen one more time.
My parents are tiger parents who won't let me to go to sleepovers.
Okay, so this marking of prominence, right, focus, right, important information is what we were seeing previously with many people, big misunderstanding of my major. There's another select segment that we want to show too that shows similar patterns. So comparing from this mirroring project to her own speech, marking contrast. And here we have recording 1, sorry, where she says, she introduces a quote from her economics professor saying, sorry, you cannot be rich by studying economics. And she doesn't even really pause between her introduction of the quote and the quote itself, which makes it hard to understand what's really being quoted as we're listening. So as we listen to this.
My professor told me, sorry, you cannot be rich by studying economics.
Okay, we're gonna listen to this one more time.
My professor told me, sorry, you cannot be rich by studying economics.
Okay, and see how this is very different from what we get in recording number 4. Okay, already you can perceive how there's more pausing between the introduction and the quote itself. You also notice she drops her voice, right, taking on the voice of her economics professor. And we see emphasis with the negative particle not, right, against this misconception.
My professor told us, sorry guys, you cannot be rich by studying economics.
Okay, so we listen one more time.
My professor told us, sorry guys, you cannot be rich by studying economics.
Okay, so clearly the top-down mirroring project in these underlying, in the final, lesson on channeling led Song and other learners too, that we didn't have time to show, but led our learners to modify their speech. So modify their pitch, their amplitude, and pausing in ways that made their speech more intelligible. So we're gonna bring this back to where this fits in the literature. So first returning to our research question, can a short-term pedagogical treatment, so 7 weeks, can this mirroring project during that time improve correlates of intelligibility? And we found that yes, with all 7 participants in a shorter 7-week course, we are able to see increases in range of pitch and in mean intensity, as well as the increased ability to use pausing in relation to mapping information structure in their discourse. All of these are known correlates of intelligibility. The suprasegmental elements that we're seeing here, so intonation, prominence, stress placement, pausing, these are all implicitly, inextricably tied to speaker identity, express speaker identity. And learning to use these elements in a second language is unlikely to be the result of a bottom-up, decontextualized, disembodied voice, very much removed from voice, emotion, and personal stance. So these are the deficiencies that we talked about earlier with a bottom-up approach, and why we are advocating for this top-down approach that begins with speaker identity, right? Contextualized to teach these important suprasegmental elements. The learners here were not only able to mirror their model speaker as they were acting, right, out this TEDx talk, but they were also able to channel these linguistic and discursive features for their own purposes, so their own presentations, as they told the class about themselves and about their major. And this might not be limited to just going back to a recording, right? It's very, very possible that, in week 8, a week later, Song could have had another new presentation, or for her future classes, that she's channeling aspects of Canwin for her presentations. So this could be further extended. The findings of this study also support past studies. So what we saw with Giora et al. And empathy, right? So having learners select for themselves, so enacting agency, learner agency, and selecting for themselves these model speakers. Perhaps this empathy allowed them to merge their language ego boundaries and adapt their pronunciation to their model speaker because of this. So supporting some of the research on empathy from the early 70s. We're also seeing, like in Moreno, that channeling another person's voice led to more target-like pronunciation patterns as we took on someone else's characteristics, their patterns of pronunciation. And these findings also reinforce current second language acquisition theories that focus on the importance of social contextual factors, so empathy, identity, personality, and voice. So for example, the Douglas Fir Group moving in more of a transdisciplinary understanding of SLA and away from a sole cognitivist approach. So with that, and Elaine, please do chime in if you wanted to add anything. I have our references just after this. I know these are small and I apologize for that, but hopefully on your computer screen, or if you come back to the video later, you'll be able to get these references. And if you have any questions, I have also included my and Elaine's email information here. Elaine, did you have anything?
It's striking to me in that last example where she is enacting the voice of her economics professor. Mm-hmm. She's clearly taking on a stance of sarcasm, I think, because she pitches him lower, but also he goes into this, sort of creaky, self-important voice, right? So she's communicating. That's double voicing, I think.
Yeah, it's language play for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Somebody did ask about whether it's possible to, let's see if I can find it. Oh, it's gone. Whether it's possible to get Praat and use it. I know that Praat's been used in the ITA courses for years now as a tool for showing these ITAs how their pitch and pausing and so forth is being carried out in videos. But I notice we don't have the citation in our bibliography for how to get Praat.
It's I have the website, or no, okay, so I don't have that. It's it's free software.
Yeah,
so
if
I can jump
in the questions.
Oh yeah, Marlene just answered that that question in the Q&A.
Thank you.
Yeah, she sent the link in the Q&A.
Okay, if it's praat.com or praat.org, but it's.
I think it's in chat, but I don't see it in Q&A right now.
Yeah, if you go to answered, it's at the very bottom of the screen.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So while we wait for folks to ask their questions in the Q&A, as one of the hosts, I'm not able to type in a question, but I do have a question, so I thought I would kick things off.
Okay.
So I was listening to your talk. I was remembering when I took an advanced speaking course when I was a student learning French, and we had to listen to, transcribe, and then emulate news broadcasts. And so it was a different way of expressing the language because intonation patterns are different, but I remember that being a very formative experience for me. But the question that I have is, are you aware of any research that focuses on learners interacting using models of speech that show what not to do? So I know that you're using sort of native speakers to sort of help guide learners to be able to emulate speech patterns, but I often, when I teach phonetics, show American speakers of French doing all the things that are characteristic of Americans speaking French, the errors that they tend to make, and we deconstruct that and analyze it. Are you aware of any research that focuses on, that shows any impact of that on student learning of pronunciation?
I don't, but I would say that they're not native. The models that the people chose were not all native speakers. They chose speakers they wanted to emulate. So somebody that they empathized with. So Colleen Meyers' earlier work publications that are in the bibliography talk about Mary, and Mary's model was not a native speaker. She was a Chinese speaker of English who was much more intelligible than she was, right? So I think it's really important that learners be able to choose who they want to model themselves after. A news broadcaster isn't necessarily my favorite model probably, but just because you want them to empathize, you want them to be able to get inside the skin of that other person. But I don't know of any studies like that. It's a nice idea.
I don't know of any. Yeah, I don't know of any studies. I know that sometimes teachers might use things like that as a pedagogical tool where, for instance, I play something that's very monotonous and ask them to pick out what the important information is, and it's hard to, and say, well, yes, so that's why we want to not have those characteristics in our speech. Just like if you were teaching writing, you might present students with short, choppy sentences and say, what do you notice about this? It's all grammatically correct, but is it good? But I don't know of any research that documents how that affects pronunciation.
I wonder whether some of the things that you think of as being no-nos are segmental. Sort of they're the no-nos that you just don't say that phoneme that way. And so
it's both. We focus on suprasegmentals and segmentals,
okay.
and we use the same clip for each set of analyses. And it's actually a very empathetic character. I'm giving too much detail, and I see there are lots of questions in the Q&A, so I'll shut up and turn off my audio and video, and you can go to the Q&A. So,
okay,
well, thank you for your question.
Yeah. And hi, Corey, and hi, Lauren. You both kind of asked the same questions. I'm going to read the question out loud. And maybe, Darren, I think you would be best to answer this rather than me, since you were teaching the class. The question from Corey is, I apologize if I missed this during the presentation, but did you anecdotally notice any changes to students' pronunciation during other in-class activities throughout this instructional sequence? In other words, did it bleed out into other discussions and activities in your class? And Lauren says, similar to Corey, I'm curious to know if you have plans to look at how this project later student-produced speaking samples like you alluded to, Darren. Something's left off there. Super interesting presentation, Darren.
Yeah, okay, so I understand both questions. So for Corey, about this bleeding out into other activities, what I can recall about this is there was a lot of playing around where there was, work time of looking at your video, comparing it, practicing, things like that, where sometimes learners to one another, they would joke around and maybe pretend to be Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie or, whoever they were trying to emulate, saying things to each other as not part of their presentations. That's the one thing that comes to mind about this also being a part, like they were playing with the language, playing with these voices as they were practicing and maybe getting peer feedback. But in other activities, when we were practicing, because this course was really a mix of, we were focused on suprasegmentals, but there was some bottom-up instruction to, what is an intonation pattern, and practicing rising and falling. The mirroring project went through the course, is kind of woven through it. But the only instances I can remember about bleed out or things like that would be, when they were a little off track, but playing around.
So I sort of tried to transcribe that. I just sent that as an answer to your question. I'm trying to write down what you say as you say it, Darren, so I can.
Oh, did you type it? Okay.
Yep.
And then for Lauren's question, we didn't. So the answer is we have not, and we don't have plans to revisit these exact same learners. If the class had continued after this. If this was, for example, a speaking listening class, and we did pronunciation in the beginning, and then later we had some presentations that weren't mirroring or things like that, that would be really interesting to look at, I agree. But we didn't for this, this project.
Okay. Colleen Meyers is listening, and she says, can you talk about the role of play in this project? I'm working with a student who is very serious about speaking English well. Someone told her that she should view learning and speaking English as a game. Oh, so I think that sometimes there are misperceptions about what language play is. We use it in the sense in which Bakhtinian used it. I've written a paper or two about it, and it has to do with just taking on other people's identities. Children do this all the time when they play. Like, okay, now I'm going to be the teacher and you be the student, or I'm going to be whatever. I mean, they shape shift, and as they do that, the way they talk can shift as well. That's not the same as taking on the learning of a language as a game, because games kind of have a sense of not being serious, not important. And I think that would be a danger of thinking about this project as a game. I don't know. What do you think, Darren?
I think that, so I would agree with you. I think there is a bit of being too serious and being too structured and not willing to modify things. If you're not a little bit willing to have dramatics in the classroom. So I wonder where all the seriousness comes from, or what the expectation is of the learner, and maybe what they're seeing this project as, if they're seeing it more as, why are we wasting our time playing, play characters when we should be focusing on hard work. Right. But I think one thing I might do is show them kind of past examples of how this actually is improving language, and it is language learning.
Mm-hmm. All right, I should have done that at the beginning. Okay, so Keiko Kawakami asks, so I assume it's better to have different teachers to let students channel different voices as a model? Mm-hmm. If so, how often should it happen? Ideally, like every day, every week, every semester, every year? Might be off topic, but I'm just curious. I think we're going to answer this live, right?
Yeah.
Okay. My first thought about this is having different teachers come in to provide different models is not the same thing as asking students to choose who they want to emulate, because it's critical. Agency is critical, and the student's choice, their ability to choose, mm-hmm. who do I want to empathize with, is critical. I mean, it's not the same thing if the teacher says, okay, here's another teacher, imitate them, empathize with them. It's not going to happen. And so I think it's not, language play is not, it's a kind of language play, don't you think, Darren?
Yeah, I think here, right, so choosing models for themselves, and these are all videos. I mean, a TEDx talk or a speech from a presidential address or something like that, they were videos. And so I think that there's a wealth of resources on the internet mm-hmm. That could be used as models. I know that for a lot of language classes, there is variation that you bring in. Maybe it's not the teacher that changes, but sometimes, for example, in the French class I teach, it's not only my voice in French or French speakers of Parisian dialect, but we also bring in French Canadian speakers and things like that to kind of bring in different accents, different voices. So I know that there is benefit to doing that, to give variety and show variety in a language, in register and dialect. I think getting students interested in popular culture of a language, whatever language, if it's a foreign language or a second language, yes. Could be very helpful for that though.
Okay. Do I have time to just slide in one comment?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but
Okay, so I wrote a paper with Meryl Swain that's relevant to this, and it's about the question is adolescents in French immersion classes would suddenly stop speaking in French when they got to talking about popular culture. And we interviewed one of those students, and she said, well, you know, there's nobody, the teacher can't sound like a kid, right? I need to be able to talk the way kids talk. And my teacher, I mean, obviously, teachers can be lame if they try to talk like a kid. So I think that's a serious issue. If you try to engineer this, it's not going to work. So somehow there has to be an element of choice. Okay, I'm done, Kate.
Thank you. So I want to thank our presenters, Elaine and Darren. And I want to thank all of you for attending. We're so delighted to have you here and to see that this online version of the speaker series is successful. We have recorded this webinar, and so keep an eye out for the recording on the Carla website, and that's where you'll be able to see the list of references. But I'm sure that if you want the references, if you contacted Elaine or Darren, they'd be happy to send you the list of references. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.